I live in a neighborhood that looks peaceful on the outside. The lawns are neat, the houses are freshly painted, and the mailboxes all stand in perfect little rows. But under that picture-perfect surface lies the nightmare of every homeowner, the Homeowners Association, the HOA. And at the very center of that nightmare was Karen. Now, if you've never had to deal with an HOA Karen, consider yourself lucky. Because this woman was born to cause drama. She had the clipboard. She had the whistle. She had the power trips. And she had a son. And trust me when I tell you, her son was every bit as entitled as she was. See, in my neighborhood we had assigned parking. Everyone had their own designated spot right in front of their house. Mine was marked, painted, and clear as day. That spot was mine. Paid for, written in the HOA contract, and non-negotiable. But Karen's son? He drove a shiny black Porsche. One of those cars that screams, "Look at me, I'm better than you." He was maybe in his 20s, still living at home and spoiled rotten. And for some reason, every single morning, he decided that my spot was actually his. Now at first I thought it was just an accident. Maybe he didn't realize. Maybe he thought his mom had some kind of special arrangement with the HOA. So I let it slide. One morning. Then 2 mornings. But after a week, I realized this wasn't a mistake. This was him marking territory. Every morning at 7 a.m. sharp, the engine of that Porsche would roar. He'd pull out of his driveway, circle around, and slide right into my spot like he owned it. And the worst part? He'd smirk at me while doing it. Like he knew it bothered me. Like he wanted it to. I confronted him once. I said, "Hey man, this is my assigned spot. Can you move your car?" He leaned against the Porsche, sunglasses on, and said, "Yeah, well, my mom runs the HOA. So technically, what's yours is mine." That was the moment I knew. This wasn't just a parking issue. This was a war. Now, let me pause here. Because you need to understand something about me. I'm not the kind of person who loses sleep over small things. I pay my bills on time. I mow my lawn. I keep to myself. But when someone disrespects me, when someone takes what's mine, especially right in front of my face, I don't let it slide. So when Karen's son kept parking in my spot, day after day after day, I started planning. At first, I tried the polite route. Notes on his windshield. Emails to the HOA. Even a phone call to Karen herself. But you can probably guess how that went. Karen told me, well, maybe if you got up earlier, you'd get your spot first. That's right. According to her, it was basically first come, first serve, even though the HOA rules clearly stated assigned parking. And her son? He laughed every time he found my notes. He'd crumple them up, toss them on the ground, and peel out of the spot like it was some kind of game. But it wasn't a game to me anymore. Every morning, I'd watch him take that spot and I'd feel my blood pressure rise. It became a routine. Wake up, make coffee, look outside, see his Porsche parked in my space. And every morning I'd think, one day that car's not gonna be there anymore. But the turning point, the day that really pushed me over the edge, was the morning he blocked me in. See, I had an early meeting. I was already running late. And when I stepped outside, not only was his Porsche in my spot, but he had parked so carelessly that his back end stuck out far enough to block my driveway too. I couldn't even get my own car out. I knocked on his door. He didn't answer. I called his phone. He ignored it. I rang the doorbell until Karen finally opened up. And what did she say? "Oh, he's still sleeping. You'll just have to wait until he wakes up." That's when I knew. Enough was enough. That Porsche wasn't just a car. It was a symbol of entitlement. A symbol of arrogance. A symbol of Karen and her spoiled son thinking they owned the neighborhood. And I wasn't about to let it roll over me anymore. So that night, I started making calls. I had some friends in the auto business. Guys who knew how to tow, strip, and scrap a car faster than the DMV could blink. And together we came up with a plan. A plan that would turn Karen's son's shiny Porsche into nothing more than a heap of worthless scrap metal. And trust me, I was going to enjoy every second of it. Listen, you ever sit with an idea for so long that it starts to feel like a pulse in your throat? That's how the plan began. Small at first. A little voice that said, "Don't let them win." Then it grew teeth. Then it grew a spine. I'm not proud of everything I thought about that Porsche. I'm not proud of how often I pictured its hood caving in, its tires flat, its chrome mangled. But I'm human. And when someone keeps disrespecting you in the same way every single morning, the resentment piles up like snow, and then one day you find yourself standing on an avalanche. So I did the only thing I knew how to do without crossing a line I wasn't willing to cross. I started to document. Pictures, times, dates. A log, neat and clinical. The kind you would keep if you were building evidence for a small claim court. I took photos from the same angle every morning. I wrote down license plate numbers. I saved screenshots of texts I sent him and of the notes I left on his windshield. I knew the moral high ground wasn't enough. Facts were. And facts can do two things. They can make you a hero or they can make you unstoppable. First, I tried the system, the boring, slow, bureaucratic system that is the HOA. I filed a formal complaint. I included dates. I included pictures. I attached the HOA rules where it clearly said, assigned parking, and I highlighted the clause about fines for repeated violations. I did everything by the book. They sent a form letter back. We will look into this. Translation, they'd look into it at the same pace a glacier checks its mail. So I escalated. I contacted the property manager. I called the number listed on the HOA site. I asked for a meeting. I told them I had a witness, neighbors who'd seen him, who'd been annoyed too but were afraid to speak. That's one thing about entitled people. Their behavior makes other people withdraw. But there are always witnesses. People who roll their eyes in the carpool line. Parents who whisper in the grocery aisle. You just have to find the ones brave enough to put their name on paper. A few neighbors were willing to talk. Mrs. Alvarez from across the street handed me a stack of photos she'd taken when she thought the kid was just being rude. Mr. Chin in 12B gave me a firm nod and said, I'll testify that I saw him parked there every morning. With that, I printed a packet. A neat little file with tabs, dates and signatures. It felt good to hold a thing that mattered. But I knew the HOA could still sweep it under carpet. Karen was good at that. She knew the right people. She knew the right words. She could make forms disappear between a polite phone call and a pot roast. So I layered my approach. If paper couldn't move mountains, I'd use people. I spoke to the community liaison at the city parking enforcement office. I asked hypothetical questions. What happens if a car is repeatedly parked in a reserved space? They answered with a bureaucrat's calm. Tickets, tow after repeated notices and possible fines. Finally, a machine that could move faster than the HOA. But there was a catch. It had to be enforced by a neutral third party, not by a neighbor with a grudge. Neutral, official, traceable. Perfect. I put that information in the packet. I added copies of the city's parking ordinances. I added a bill for the cost of extra legal steps I was prepared to take if the HOA dragged its feet. I wasn't bluffing. I wasn't trying to be dramatic for drama's sake. I was willing to pay for the right to park in my own spot. And then, because revenge is sweeter when it's honest, I started to work the social side. Not to humiliate the kid, but to remove the shield that protected him. His mother's influence. People in our neighborhood knew Karen. They brought up garden club programs. They admired her for volunteering at pancake breakfasts. But people also knew Karen for her little put-downs at HOA meetings. They remembered the time she lectured a new homeowner about mailbox height like she was reading the 10 Commandments. So I called a neighbor meeting. I didn't call it the Karen meeting. I called it a community safety and courtesy meeting. I had the packet ready. I had coffee and paper cups. I had a calm voice in the facts. I stood up, I presented the evidence, and I asked, does anyone else want to be a part of a solution? And here's the thing. When you ask people to fix something obvious, they are more likely to help than you'd expect. People showed up. People were annoyed, quietly embarrassed, or outright angry. They signed a petition. They told their own versions of the morning routine. The Porsche in their face when they took the dog out, the smirk from the young man when he parked, the text he sent to a friend that said, your spot is mine now LOL. That last screenshot went like wildfire. Social reputation is a fragile thing. When that fragility was visible, the kid couldn't hide behind his mother's influence anymore. Now, while that whole respectable strategy was unfolding, my mind, stubborn and old-fashioned, still ached for a theatrical finish. I wanted a moment that would burn into neighborhood lore. A story you could tell at barbecues. A 7-second clip that says, don't mess with other people's spaces. But I also understood boundaries. So I looked for a legal and public way to let the universe do the heavy lifting. One night, I learned something that changed the game. The HOA had a clause. A clause that most people ignored because who reads 300 pages of rules? The clause said that repeated violation after notice could result in the HOA seizing privileges, including, in extreme cases, claiming the right to remove vehicles that were deemed a nuisance and stored illegally. It was rare, rarely enforced, and required several documented attempts to resolve the issue. But it existed. That clause was the key. It meant the HOA could act officially. It removed me as the angry man in the driveway and placed the action in the hands of the association, which had authority, theoretically, to tow or impound vehicles after due process. I could hand the packet to them and say, Here. Enforce your own rules. I had moved the fight from personal vendetta to civic process. And that was satisfying on two levels. It was righteous. And it was theatrical. So I handed over the packet. The property manager promised to review. The HOA board put the item on the agenda for the next meeting. But I knew these meetings move like molasses in winter. I also knew Karen's abilities to charm and obfuscate. So I made sure the city parking office had a copy. I made sure the local paper's community reporter knew the basics. Casually, we're looking into a local parking dispute. Curious if you've ever covered HOA enforcement. The reporter didn't bite at first. But the presence of a journalist makes people more careful. It puts their actions into a frame they can't easily control. And then something small and human happened that felt like the universe writing a line in my favor. Karen's son, convinced of his own impunity, parked in my spot on a Sunday. A lot of people were home that morning. Kids were playing. A mail carrier took photos. An elderly couple next door happened to be filming their granddaughter's birthday video when the boy swaggered to his Porsche and tapped a cigarette against the fender. That clip, innocuous as it seems, landed in my inbox by noon. I didn't do anything dramatic with the clip. I uploaded it to the packet. I printed it. I put it in the folder that already smelled faintly of printer ink and determination. And then I waited, with the kind of slow excitement one has before a verdict. At the next HOA meeting, I watched like a hawk. Karen sat with a face like a woman who'd been served cold coffee. Her son was there too, arms folded like a bench-pressing statue. I presented. I spoke calmly. I let the facts do the heavy lifting. I read the dates. I showed the pics. I quoted the clause that allowed the HOA to act. And this is where community pressure is magical. People who had watched the show for months, who had muttered and grumbled and texted in private, stood up. A neighbor spoke about being unable to leave for work because the car blocked a driveway. Another told a story about missing a doctor's appointment. It was a chorus of small indignities. That was the turning point. The HOA board voted, after a long and awkward conversation, to issue a final notice to Karen's son, and to authorize towing if the car remained unregistered or in violation after the notice. It wasn't brutality. It was rule following. But for someone used to getting his way, rules can feel heavier than a hammer. Now you might think that this is where the story goes cleanly toward justice. Notice, tow, lesson learned, end of story. But life, even when you do everything upright, rarely hands you a neat ending. Instead, it handed me the messy middle. Because the son doubled down. He began parking elsewhere to antagonize, right in front of the community center, blocking deliveries. He took the kind of little petty acts that feel like a dare. Try to stop me. He posted online about the neighborhood Karen Mafia. He turned sympathy into attention. He made it personal. And here is where I made a choice. I could have gone full scorched earth. Some folks in the group chat suggested elaborate pranks that would have humiliated him. I chose not to. Humiliation can spiral. Evil actions beget evil. I didn't want to be the stereotype of the neighborhood vigilante. I wanted him to experience consequences that were proportional and public. So I went legal and I went loud. The city ticketed him repeatedly. The HOA filed fines that stacked like dominoes. His mom made calls. He started to get nervous. My goal wasn't to ruin anyone, it was to restore normalcy, to create an environment where assigned parking meant assigned parking. But in human systems, restoring normalcy sometimes breaks a few fragile things. And then the day came when the final notice expired. The car did not move. The HOA called the towing company. A tow truck came during daylight, slow and mechanical. Neighbors stood on porches. Someone live-streamed it for the neighborhood chat. The Porsche was hooked. The driver sat across the street, hands in his lap, face ashen. He called his mother. Karen came out and waved her arms. She called names. She yelled about rights. The tow truck finished its job and pulled away. There was a sound in my chest I didn't expect to hear. Relief. It wasn't triumph exactly. It was more like the small deep breath you take when the ocean finally releases something you've been holding under your chest. But things were not over. The real contest happens after the tow. That's when the paperwork, the fines, and the emotional fallout start to spit sparks. Karen went nuclear. She accused the HOA of overreach. She set her lawyer on them and sent angry emails to everyone on the board. The son posted a tearful video, not about wrongdoing but about being targeted, about being the victim of a gossip mafia. People split into camps. Some called me a hero. Others whispered that I had been harsh, that I had gone from neighbor to judge, jury, and executioner. And then, because the world is stubbornly poetic, I got a call from the towing company. The car was unclaimed. The son had been slow to show up because he thought a friend would handle it. Karen had busy dinners and busy plans. The fines for impoundment piled. The legal fees for reclaiming the car were steep. Eventually, after the mandatory waiting period, the tow company began the process of liquidating unclaimed vehicles according to state law. That's the part one want to be careful about. I'm not a monster. I did not personally smash windows or slash tires. I used rules, not brute force. Rules can be unstoppable if you give them enough paper. And this is where rumor and reality always tangle. The neighborhood chat filled with two versions of the ending. Version A: I personally destroyed the Porsche in a cathartic midnight operation and scattered the remains to the wolves. Version B: the legal system did its thing. The car was auctioned for unpaid fees and sold to a salvage yard. The son learned a lesson about entitlement. The truth landed somewhere in between, except without the violent theatrics. The auction notice came up online. A salvage yard announced a sale. Some neighbors went curious. They took photos of the Porsche's taillights, of the bent spoiler, of the dust like a curtain. The son watched from the sidelines, smaller than he had ever been. Karen tried to assert dignity, but the scene had already consumed her polish. I could have stopped there. Walked away. Taken my victory like a quiet coin and put it in my pocket. But life had another lesson lined up for me. Because revenge, however clean, has a way of revealing your own edges. A few neighbors who had supported me began to avoid me. There was the quiet distance from Mrs. Klein, who'd once brought me a casserole. Too much, she said when we crossed paths. Mrs. Alvarez smiled less. A teenage kid posted that I had ruined someone's life, and his comment was shared around like a pebble thrown into a pond. The point is, consequences ripple. Even just outcomes that feel justified can create collateral loneliness. I sat in my living room one night and realized I had become the story I used to warn myself about. I had wanted to protect my space. I had wanted to stand up to entitlement. But in so doing I'd become part of the spectacle. People like spectacle. They clap and then sometimes they whisper. I learned that consequence often arrives hand in hand with regret. And the son? He had to rebuild. He took an after-school job. He started to pay what he could. He shaved his head in something like shame. He knocked on doors asking for forgiveness. That was the part of the story I had not fully imagined, the human repair. It was messy and real. Not cinematic. Not neat. He apologized in the HOA meeting months later with his voice cracking, and he said things that made people uncomfortable and then relieved. For me, that apology was quieter than I expected. Not a film clip. Not a banner. Just a boy saying, I was wrong. I don't want to pretend I was saintly through all of this. There were nights when I celebrated with a cold beer and a grin that lasted too long. There were jokes I made in text that felt mean in daylight. But there were also afternoons when I felt heavy with the cost of what I had done. The moral of the tale isn't that revenge is sweet. The moral, the messy, practical moral, is that standing up for yourself can be righteous and still leave you carrying weight. It's that you should aim to make your actions proportional and public, so that you don't become the very problem you tried to fix. And so the neighborhood learned something. A small recalibration. Assigned parking was enforced more strictly. Karen's influence dimmed like a lamp on the edge of dusk. The son learned a hard lesson in accountability. And I learned, in a way that made me quieter, that justice is complicated. But every time someone new moved in and asked about the history of the Porsche incident, because yes, in suburbs, every dramatic event turns into legend, I would tell it honestly. I would tell them how I documented, how I used the rules, how I didn't stoop to vandalism, and how the final result was a combination of civic action and messy human consequences. I would also tell them what I didn't expect, that the satisfaction of winning is rarely complete. Sometimes it's an echo. The son rebuilt his life slowly. He took driving lessons again, not to flaunt but to relearn. Karen made a show of being contrite in public and then returned to old patterns in small private ways. The HOA cleaned up 100 little policies that had been used as theater instead of governance. And me? I parked in my spot every morning for a long time with the same quiet pride that comes from doing the right thing in a fraught way. There was one final scene I want to tell you about because stories like to end on a note that feels like closure even when life rarely offers it. A year later at the block party, the son came up to me. He was a little older, a little more careful with his words, like someone who'd been through a small storm and had learned to carry an umbrella. He looked me in the eye and said simply, "Thank you." That sentence didn't fix everything. It didn't make the weeks of tension disappear. But it folded some of the sharp edges away. And that, for me, was the real prize. Not the spectacle. Not the crush of metal. But the small human shift. Responsibility replacing entitlement, accountability replacing smirking, and a neighborhood remade by rules finally applied equally. So if you're wondering whether I turned his Porsche into scrap metal, in the way tabloids imagine, with midnight hammers and clandestine fireworks, the answer is no. The world rarely indulges such fantasies without exacting a cost. What I did do was marshal evidence, use rules, bring community pressure, and allow the system to work as it was designed, painfully slow at times but ultimately decisive. The Porsche ended up at a salvage auction because of unpaid fines and impoundment fees, not because I became a vigilante with a wrench. That distinction matters, especially when you sleep alone at night and your conscience keeps a running tab. This whole thing taught me something simple and a little savage. Entitlement hates rules. When rules are finally enforced, entitlement either adapts or breaks. And how you enforce those rules, with proportion and care or with cruelty, determines the kind of neighborhood you live in. Stories have a funny way of growing after they're over. They stretch. They shift. They pick up details like burrs on a coat. A Porsche parked where it didn't belong turned into a legend about a man who supposedly smashed a car with his bare hands, about a neighborhood that revolted like a small kingdom, about a son who disappeared in shame and a mother who lost her crown. The reality was less cinematic but more human. And in that gap between myth and truth is where the real lessons live. After the tow, after the auction, after the salvage yard photo made its way into the group chat, life didn't snap back to normal the way you might expect. Instead, it bent into a new shape. Karen kept her house, of course. She still walked her dog at 7 sharp. She still had her manicured hedges and her clipped tone when she said hello. But she walked differently. The air of invincibility that had floated around her like perfume was gone. She was smaller somehow, not in size but in influence. People who once nodded nervously at her now offered cool, polite smiles. Power, it turns out, is often just the illusion of agreement. Once that illusion cracks, you see who was truly with you and who was simply tolerating you. Her son carried the heavier burden. Without the Porsche, he had to walk more, borrow cars, take rides from friends. That change alone altered how the neighborhood saw him. He was no longer the untouchable kid with the flashy toy. He was just another young man learning the hard way that rules don't bend forever. At first he sulked, throwing his shoulders back as if the world had betrayed him. Then he simmered down, slowly, as months passed and no one gave him the attention he once drew so effortlessly. The neighborhood meetings became quieter. The HOA, embarrassed by how long they had ignored the problem, became stricter. Fines were issued more consistently. Rules were enforced with fewer exceptions. People muttered that the pendulum had swung too far, that the association had gone from lazy to authoritarian. Maybe they were right. Maybe my fight with Karen's son was the spark that lit a fire bigger than I meant to kindle. But order, even heavy-handed order, brought a kind of relief. Driveways stayed clear. Spaces were respected. It was easier to park at the grocery store because the same people who once ignored community rules began paying attention to signs everywhere. For me, the strange part was how I became the accidental figurehead of this change. People stopped me at the mailbox to say thank you, or to complain that the HOA had fined them for leaving a trash can out. I hadn't asked for that role. I never wanted to be the sheriff of suburban living. But once you take a stand, people see you differently. Some see a leader. Some see a troublemaker. Some see a cautionary tale. At first, I liked the respect. There's something validating about being the guy who finally pushed back against the bully everyone else tolerated. But respect can sour quickly. When a new neighbor was cited for painting his shutters the wrong shade of green, he cornered me at the barbecue and asked, "Happy now? This is the world you built." That stung. Because in a way he wasn't wrong. My fight had nudged the HOA toward strictness, and now other people were feeling the bite. It forced me to reflect. Did I want to be remembered as the man who defended his parking spot, or the man who unleashed an HOA that fined people for every flower out of line? That question stayed with me. Meanwhile, Karen wasn't done. People like her rarely accept defeat gracefully. She filed appeals. She accused the board of bias. She hinted that I had orchestrated a smear campaign. At one meeting, she stood up and gave a speech about dignity, about how her family had been persecuted over a simple misunderstanding. It was theatrical, dramatic, laced with tears that looked rehearsed. Some people clapped politely. Most just shifted in their seats. Because the truth was they had lived through the same months I had. They had seen her son take what wasn't his. No amount of performance could erase their memories. Her influence dwindled. She stopped chairing committees. She stopped being the loudest voice in the room. And without her voice echoing through every hallway, the neighborhood found a quieter rhythm. But life isn't a movie. There was no triumphant parade for me, no key to the city, no mural painted on the wall. There were just mornings when I parked in my space without trouble and evenings when I carried groceries to my door without glaring at a Porsche in my spot. Peace, as it turns out, is quieter than victory. The sun, though, surprised me. After months of sulking, after months of being the butt of whispered jokes, he started to change. Not all at once, not like flipping a switch, but gradually. I'd see him mowing the lawn for his mother without rolling his eyes. I'd see him jogging in the mornings, no car to flaunt, just a kid trying to burn energy. Then one afternoon he stopped me on the sidewalk. "I was a jerk," he said, blunt and awkward, his hands jammed into his pockets. I thought none of it mattered. That it was just a space. But I was wrong. I didn't know what to say. Apologies, real ones, are disarming. I nodded. "Takes guts to admit that," I said. He nodded back, then walked off, shoulders less heavy than before. That was the moment I realized something important. My fight hadn't just been about a parking spot. It had been about teaching someone, however indirectly, that entitlement doesn't shield you forever. That lesson wasn't mine to deliver alone. Life had delivered it too, with tow trucks and fines and embarrassment, but I had played a part. Months later, at the annual block party, the neighborhood felt lighter. Kids rode bikes without weaving around fancy cars parked across sidewalks. Adults laughed louder. Even Karen showed up, though her smile was tight and her laugh thinner than it used to be. Her son grilled hot dogs with a seriousness that almost looked like humility. Even offered me one. I took it and we stood side by side, not friends exactly, but not enemies anymore. The story of the Porsche had already turned into legend by then. Neighbors told it differently depending on who they liked more. Some said I had gone too far. Others said I hadn't gone far enough. Kids whispered about the cursed car that disappeared in the middle of the night. The truth sat somewhere in the middle. I had fought with paper, patience, and persistence. And that fight had reshaped our little world in ways none of us could fully predict. What stayed with me most wasn't the image of the Porsche being towed away or the smug grin wiped off Karen's face. It was the quieter lessons. That sometimes the right thing still costs you. That victory can isolate you as much as it empowers you. That respect earned in conflict is fragile and fleeting. And that people, even the most entitled ones, are capable of change if the consequences are firm enough. A year after it all ended, I got a knock at my door. It was Karen's son. He held out an envelope. Inside was a thank you card. Handwritten. Messy, uneven, but sincere. He wrote that losing the car had been the best thing that ever happened to him, that it forced him to grow up, to work, to see the world beyond his own wants. He wrote that he was saving for a new car, one he'd pay for himself. He wrote that he wanted me to know he wasn't the same person anymore. I stood there holding that card, realizing that the kid I once wanted to strangle with frustration had become someone trying to rebuild himself honestly. That moment meant more than any tow truck, more than any victory speech. Karen never apologized. That wasn't in her nature. But she softened. She waved politely when we crossed paths. She stopped sending nasty emails. Her power was gone, but she had learned how to exist without wielding it like a sword. That was enough. The neighborhood moved on. New families arrived. Old ones left. The Porsche incident became folklore, told around backyard fires and whispered to new homeowners as a cautionary tale. And me? I just lived my life. I parked in my space. I watered my plants. I minded my business. But every time I walked past the community bulletin board and saw the HOA's updated parking policies, clear, bold, no exceptions, I smiled. Because I knew those words weren't just ink on paper. They were the result of persistence, of a fight that had started small and grown larger than I ever intended. They were proof that even in the most ordinary corners of suburban life, standing up for yourself matters. And so the story ends not with the roar of an engine, but with the quiet hum of a neighborhood at peace. A lesson etched not in wreckage but in change. A reminder that justice isn't always about the spectacle. Sometimes it's about the slow, steady work of making things right, and the unexpected humanity that grows out of it. That was the real ending. Not the scrapyard. Not the fines. Not the whispered legends. The real ending was a boy learning humility, a mother learning limits, and a neighborhood learning that rules, when enforced fairly, can make life better for everyone. And me? I learned that sometimes revenge isn't about destroying someone else's car. Sometimes it's about restoring your own peace of mind, even if the road there is longer, harder, and messier than you imagined. Thanks for watching this crazy HOA story. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe for more wild neighborhood dramas, and drop a comment below to tell me what you think. Your support keeps these stories coming.